My name is Kevin Nguyen. I'm a 1L law student here at the University of Colorado. I'm very honored to have the privilege of introducing this next panel, The Aches and Pains of Broadband Deployment and Adoption, moderated by Gabrielle Daley. Thank you.
Welcome everyone to the last panel of the conference. I am just thrilled that we get the chance to nerd out about one of my favorite subjects, broadband, specifically broadband adoption and deployment. I'm grateful to be joined today by this wonderful group of panelists that I'm going to go down and introduce. We have Nirali Patel, Senior Vice President, Policy and Advocacy at USTelecom, the Broadband Association. Justin Faulb, Chief of Staff and Wireline Advisor to Commissioner Geoffrey Starks of the Federal Communications Commission. Brandy Reitter, Executive Director of the Colorado Broadband Office from the Governor's Office of Information and Technology. Kathryn DeWitt, Project Director, Broadband Access Initiative from Pew Charitable Trust. And Francella Ochillo, Executive Director of Next Century Cities. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'll refer everyone in the audience to the literature for any additional details about our esteemed panelists. So yesterday during our afternoon session, Alan Davidson of the National Telecommunications and Information Administration called on us all to pay close attention to what's happening with broadband policy, saying that it was this generation's big infrastructure moment. So Kathryn, could you start us off with some background on what's happening with that moment with broadband adoption and deployment?
Sure. So thank you so much for inviting me to be here. It's always a pleasure and always great to join folks like this on panels. So I really appreciated Assistant Secretary Davidson's remarks yesterday, particularly when he referred to the implementation of the BEAD and DEA programs as finally having the opportunity to do something structural and serious about broadband deployment, digital equity. And for the purposes of this conversation, I am going to include availability. So when we talk about deployment, but availability under digital equity. And that's because all other efforts, whether we're talking about affordability, digital literacy, access to devices, you name it, the long list, whether you define it as a 3 or 5 leg stool, availability, none of that matters if those connections aren't available. And so when we talk about the opportunities that we have at hand, it's not just the significant resources, of which they are significant. Let me be very clear about that. $42.5 billion in the BEAD program, $3.75 billion, that's all with a B in the DEA programs. This also does not include funds that are available through the American Rescue Plan Act, specifically the Capital Projects Fund, as well as the State Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, as well as other funds that states have already put forward towards broadband. But when we talk about moving ahead and implementing funds from IIJA, we are really talking about the whole package here. It's not just availability, affordability, access to devices, skills, and training. It's also about enabling states to really create frameworks within government to institutionalize these efforts moving forward. And it's also about giving the authority to state government and also local government and other partners at the local level to engage in these funding and planning processes in ways that they have never had the authority to do before. And those may seem like small changes, but they are actually incredibly significant because we are at the hardest part of closing the digital divide. And a personal pet peeve of mine is people say, oh, COVID changed the way we think about the digital divide. COVID didn't change the way we think about the digital divide. What it did was it added a lot of texture and context to what had previously been treated as a very binary discussion, particularly when it comes to policy. Was broadband available or was it not? But during COVID, what we really got into was understanding, well, how many Americans have access or don't? Why can't we really calculate that number? When we talk about the number of Americans, so that's availability, okay. Let's talk about speed, quality, reliability. More conversations around that. When you have that connection available, the presence of a connection that may or may not meet speeds, that's not enough for us to really understand whether or not that connection is meaningful for people. Now let's talk about cost. 45% of non-adopters cite the cost of a subscription as the primary barrier to the reason they don't adopt at home. And 4 in 10 non-adopters cite the cost of a device. Those are really important factors. Finally, when we look at the distribution of folks who don't have access, whether that's because it's not unavailable or they can't afford it, the statistical significance is in income. If you are low income in America, you are less likely to have a broadband connection available, and you are less likely to adopt at home. To put that in numbers, if you're making 92% of households making $75,000 or more have access and adopt, versus 57% of households making $30,000 or less. So when I talk about what COVID did and what drove us to this moment that we're in, and I promise I'll wrap it up so other people can weigh in. It added that texture and it added momentum to what was already happening, particularly at the state level. So it enabled us to really refine policy to not only say, okay, are we just getting broadband out, but are we getting it to the people who need it most? Are we being thoughtful about the policy measures that we are adding to this to ensure that we're getting to those people? How are we thinking about enforcement? How are we thinking about structuring both supply and demand side policies and interventions to meet both the capital expenditure challenge here, but as well as the challenges that face consumers and their ability to adopt what is a very, very important connection in our daily lives. So we've really heard kind of the overview of the cost or the spend of what's coming with IIJA. And I think that looking ahead, as we think about and we talk on this panel, it's going to be really important for y'all to pay attention to a couple of things. First are the plans and the proposals that states are putting forward. What are they saying are their priorities for spending, and how are they going to get folks connected to those minimum speed and technological standards that Congress has set forth? How are they going to work with those historically disadvantaged populations to ensure that they have a seat at the table? How are they working with local leaders? Okay, statements are one thing, then what's the follow through? Because we can write great policy, we can say that we have these structural changes, we can put the money forward, but if we don't have the enforcement associated with it, we don't have the follow up, that's with the public sector, that's also with the folks who are receiving funds, none of this actually matters. So that's a really uplifting way to start the panel.
Perfect. Thank you for that.
Welcome.
Kathryn. Okay, so but before we dive into our main discussion, I'd like to ask each of you, and we can just go down the line, to say just a little bit about why this subject matter is so important to the advocacy and the constituencies that you represent. So Nirali, can you kick us off with that?
Sure. This matters to USTelecom certainly because our members include broadband providers of all sizes, from the largest providers spanning the country to local and regional providers that have been serving the hardest to reach rural communities for decades. And we look forward to working with our partners in the public sector, in the community, and the private sector to really reach our shared goal of connecting everyone, particularly during this historic opportunity presented by the Infrastructure Act.
Yeah, and for the FCC, and I should probably start with the caveat, that's super fun when you're a government staffer. I am speaking for myself, the FCC, or for Commissioner Starks on this. These are just my views. But for the FCC, we've been working on closing the digital divide for much longer than I've been practicing as a lawyer, which has been quite a long time. And so it's really exciting for us to see this much of a resource push now to try to close the digital divide and continue the goals of universal service that are contained in the FCC's founding statute.
So for the state of Colorado, this subject's really important statewide for a number of reasons that existed way before COVID did, but were exacerbated by COVID, is just access to internet. I mean, broadband is at the intersection of everything we do. And when you don't have access to it, you don't have access to adequate education, healthcare, economic vitality and development, and public safety. Those are the big pillars of why great connectivity to broadband, or at least having access to it, is really important, because when you don't have it, you're being left behind. You can't participate in the economy, and you can't move your communities forward. And so, during the pandemic, this was absolutely, we brought awareness to these issues. There were a lot of people that could not work They couldn't become educated. They couldn't attend school online. They couldn't access healthcare. And public safety for the state of Colorado is a big deal as well. You know, between fires and blizzards and floods, you know, when you don't have connectivity, you can't even respond to critical incidences. And I've seen that just, you know, firsthand in communities where, you know, we have a fire and first responders can't talk to each other. It's a huge safety issue. So that's why it's important to the state of Colorado and to many in this room and in our communities.
Good morning, everybody. First, I want to also say thank you, Kevin, for the warm introduction, and also Gabrielle for all the work that you put into this discussion, just outlining it. My name is Francella. I'm Executive Director of Next Century Cities, and if in a snapshot, I could say why it's important for us to be involved in this debate is that we work on making sure that local leaders have a voice in policymaking at every level of government, whether we're talking about county level, state level, federal level. We want to make sure that they're part of the conversation, and historically they have not been included in the proceedings where broadband policies are made and funding is assigned. But just as a human, I think maybe it's more important for me to say why I'm in this room. I'm looking around the room and seeing people who know, I think honestly have forgotten more about tech policy than I will ever know. There are people in this room who've been working on these issues since before I was in law school, since back in the days when I was working on trying to reconstruct mortgage-backed securities and looking at very, very different issues. I want to acknowledge that even us having this conversation is because we stand on their shoulders of whether it's the academic prowess, the ideas, the work, we stand on their shoulders to even have this conversation. But for the students in this room, the reason why I'm here is because I don't want you to be discouraged that other people's tenure makes your ideas any less important. And I think that when we're having these conversations, sometimes we forget about having to have imagination. We forget about having to have accountability with people who aren't as entrenched and indoctrinated in the way we think about it, to come to the table and say, hey, if that hasn't worked for the past 15 years, why don't we try something new? And for them to be able to say that without that being a threat to everyone else's tenure. So I encourage everybody in these conversations today, and I know that it's the last conversation in this conference, but to really ask yourselves not necessarily about the things that came up today, but what are you going to do about it? Because I think so many times we come into these rooms to high-five each other on what's working or maybe what we've abandoned and give ourselves a little bit of credit for that. And we haven't made room at the table for people who might have some of the most extraordinary ideas, but they aren't necessarily cloaked in the organization that gets airtime. They don't have a platform to share it. And I just maybe think me even being here is just to make sure that they have a way in.
Thank you for that. Okay. So I want to move us into our first main question here, which is to start talking about some of these impacts, right? So what are the impacts that you are seeing of digital inequity on individuals, on communities, and to sort of tie that to this motivational piece that we just touched on? Actually, Francella, could I ask you to start us off with this one, and then we'll open it up?
So maybe if I could focus on because I know that other panelists are going to focus on like what's at stake and like specifically like harms and like what are the things we should be thinking about. But my scholarship outside of NCC focuses on what's the collective effect on people who are connected. I think we don't talk about that often enough, that when we have high populations of people that do not have direct access to connectivity or don't have reliable connectivity, there's actually a tax on their entire community and an actual indirect cost to the connected populations. So for example, if you are in a place, for example, like St. Louis, Detroit, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Stockton, California, places like that, where you have high concentrations of blocks after blocks, where you have people that do not have reliable access, the issue isn't just getting them connected with a low income plan or saying, let's provide some sort of access at a school or a library. We should be also talking about what is the cost for everyone else in the county when you have high populations that are concentrated that essentially not only are going to pay more for service that isn't as good, they don't necessarily have computing devices or the digital literacy to be able to take advantage of those advances in technology, what happens to their wages when it's slightly lower in that center pocket? Because everyone else who's connected to them pays a little bit more, doesn't make as much money. What does it cost in our social service costs when we pay more because they don't have preventative care? If you go to Washington, DC, if you're in Anacostia, there is no hospital for people to give birth. So what happens? Most of those women get no preventative care, and the first time they see a doctor is when they go to the hospital. So all of us who are in my zip code in the 5th ward, we all pay more money because that hospital is in my neighborhood. And so people aren't talking about the fact that I still pay something for them to not be able to get on maybe a telehealth appointment that could have avoided some complications. We pay for it. So I do want us to be mindful of the fact that it's not just the cost to the household that's disconnected. There's actually a cost to NERD to all of us who are connected and adjacent to them. And so that cost might show up in reduced academic rigor. It might show up in higher healthcare or other costs. It might show up in us having less competitive workforce, whether it's at the state or the domestic or the national level. It also shows up in us not being as competitive with other countries, because essentially when we don't have that type of training, and when we think about who are the people who are digital natives, who are going to have very different career options and also higher earning power, as opposed to people who might be getting emails for the first time last year during the pandemic, those people might always work in hourly jobs where they work with their bodies. They don't necessarily have access to the same assets and the same income that we have. And so as long as they work in hourly wages, there's always a cost for all of us. So I do want to make sure that that's part of the conversation, because it very rarely gets any headlines.
And before, I think as several of you, well, many folks may be taking furious notes right now, let me also be clear, +1 to what Francella said, but also let's be very blunt about this. Access to a broadband connection and your basic digital literacy skills, access to devices, these things are not going to solve structural inequality. They're not going to solve structural societal issues. They can't do that by themselves. That's not what they can do. But when we think about this in the context of how we are applying these investments in technology, in skills, in access to devices, how are we pulling those investments and pushing them towards work in workforce development, thinking about increasing access to healthcare? How are we looking at other systems that rely on these connections, that rely on folks needing, basic digital literacy skills? This is the bridge that we need to start building between the field that we work in and all these other industries and disciplines that rely on the work that we are all doing on a day-to-day basis. And so as we think about looking at the impacts of digital equity, one, when we look at measurement, the first question is always, did we achieve what statute told us to do? First order of importance. The second is then how states talking about their priorities in spending, what are they tying that to, and how can we really measure that? And how can we measure that in a way that's meaningful, recognizing that it is really difficult to draw a macro conclusion around the economic impact of broadband on GDP. But can we talk about it at the local level? Can we talk about it at the neighborhood level? That's what we talk about with digital equity programming. Take it to the locals, let it reflect local need, local priorities. So we have to implement our evaluation plans and evaluation strategies to reflect those priorities and tie them accordingly. I think that the other thing too, and to Francella's point, one of the benefits of COVID did help, again, help us ask better questions in our understanding around cost, affordability, and more importantly, cost burden on households. One study that came out from the California Emerging Technology Fund found that about a quarter of those surveyed said that they cut costs on monthly household necessities in order to pay for broadband. That doesn't tell us what to do, but that helps us ask better questions. So to the students in the room, I think it's also important to look at research not always as, okay, this is going to provide us the answer that we need, it's going to give us the direction that it needs, but how are we asking, how are we collecting data, how are we asking better questions that will eventually lead us to the outcomes that we need to identify?
Brandy, can I invite you into the conversation? So what are some of the impacts of digital inequity that you were saying on individuals and communities here in Colorado?
Yeah, thanks, Gabrielle, for that question. You know, the state of Colorado, we're pretty tuned into the digital equity conversations. You know, it's a huge part of the digital divide connecting our communities. You know, and you know what is it? You know, it's access to internet, but it's also affordability, it's devices, it's literacy, as my colleagues mentioned. You know, for the state of Colorado, you know, we did a strategic plan last year. Because you have to kind of know where you are before you know where you can head. And so data collection is a big piece of understanding how to prioritize and what's important to communities. Also understanding from a stakeholder perspective, engaging stakeholders across communities and even within the state agencies. You know, we did a lot of outreach. We talked to over 2,000 residents, 180 local governments, and talked to nonprofits serving marginalized communities to collect the data that we needed to figure out, well, how big is the digital equity gap? And so, you know, I was kind of surprised by the results, but not surprised. You know, for us, you know, we have about 166,000 households that are not connected to high-speed internet or adequate internet. And, you know, a little over half was just physical infrastructure. Like we don't have fiber, we don't have wireless. I just use my cell phone when the cell tower works. But the other half, which was around 44%, digital equity was the reason why they could not connect. They literally have those assets sitting outside their house. They cannot connect because they can't afford it, which was the number one response. They could not afford their internet bills. And so when you're looking at prioritizing your household budget, internet, you know, depending on how your situation, you might not pay for it. Thankfully, with programs like the Affordable Connectivity Program and other programs, subsidies that we provide at the state, you know, we're able to provide a little bit of relief for residents. I feel like it could be more, you know, but you know, it's super helpful. We have around 24% of eligible households in the state signing up for those programs. And so we're doing a lot of outreach. So as a state, you know, you have to do a lot of outreach to promote these programs. You know, residents in our communities, they don't live in our world every day. So, you know, you have to figure out where they are. A long time ago, I used to think that, you know, the local newspaper was kind of a thing of the past. It was a relic. But then I realized over the years that that's how a lot of people get their information. And so, you know, we figured out a really great way to kind of cross promote and have our materials promoted by other local media outlets to advertise for a lot of those programs. And we saw an uptick in those programs because they're just not readily available or they're not readily advertised. Devices, you know, we're looking at devices. We partner with our library district, our school district to figure out how to get people the devices they need. Nonprofit partners are other really great option that we have. There's one that I particularly like. It's PCs for People. You know, they're a local nonprofit. They refurbish, you know, outdated or, you know, PCs that people cycle out through the businesses. You have a three-year replacement cycle. A lot of those devices are you can still use them. And so it was really great because I ran across them several weeks ago and they saw their demand increase significantly. I mean, they literally quadrupled their business during COVID, and they continue to see requests. So really partnering with those local providers to provide these low-cost devices has been helpful. Digital literacy is a tough nut to crack. That's what I tell people. And so what we have done as the state of Colorado is we partner with the Office of Future Work and the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment. And what we do there is we did a pilot of digital navigators in the southwest part of our state around Durango. And we leveraged Fort Lewis State College. We also leveraged the tribal nations down there. And we hired some digital navigators to go into community, again, at the local level, because you know what? You're going to know your neighbor. You're going to be the most comfortable with your community member, your fellow citizen, than maybe somebody at the state of Colorado. And so we hired a bunch of local navigators to work with those vulnerable populations to help them skill up, learn how to use the internet, get access to devices that they didn't have otherwise. And the really great part about that is from a workforce development perspective, and this goes back to my earlier statement about, you know, participating in the economy. You know, a lot of jobs, you know, they're technology based. You have to use a computer. Now there's jobs that you don't, but even then you still have to, you know, clock in using a timesheet, right? So you're using technology regardless of what your role is. And so through our digital navigator program, teaching people how to use the internet, we're indirectly helping them skill up for some of those jobs that that are existing in their area. So it helps them, prosper economically, financially, and participate in their local economy. And so those are some of the things that we've done. You know, for us, the affordability access, we had out of 166,000 households, 93,000, it's physical access to internet. The other 73,000 or 75,000 is for digital literacy. So we have a lot of households we have to serve. You know, and part of the state's role is to hear from communities, design local solutions. It's not a one size fits all in Colorado. The geographic areas are very different. The topography, our communities are very different. We have urban, we have rural, we have Eastern Plains, we have resort towns. I mean, you name it, we have it. And so, we work really closely with our local communities to design those local solutions. Libraries play a big key, they're a big partner in the digital equity space for us. A lot of the folks that don't have internet do go to the library. So we focus really intently on our community anchor institutions in these communities, especially the really rural ones, our school districts. So, we use our libraries to kind of deploy resources and digital literacy programs through those communities that they're pretty remote or not remote, because even in the urban areas, we have issues. Partnerships are key. The Colorado Broadband Office, we can't do the work that we do without Colorado Department of Labor and Employment, Colorado Department of Local Affairs, which is our local government liaison agency, as well as libraries and the Department of Education. And our local nonprofits. So we leverage a lot of folks to get this work done. And then the other piece to it as well, which we were working on last year and we're rolling it forward, especially with all of our Digital Equity Act planning and distributions of funds, is evaluation. Going back to those interventions that we prioritized over the last couple of years and evaluate how did it work? Did we actually serve and meet the needs of the community? For people more literate on the internet, how many devices did they get, And so the evaluation piece is key. I always talk about that because I think sometimes in government, we have a lot of whiz-bang ideas. And when we forget to evaluate after the fact, and then we have to respond to our local elected officials, how do we do? So, and then when you learn something, lessons learned, we've had a lot of lessons learned over the last 12 months. I've been in my role 12 months. That what works, and what didn't work, and how do we tweak those interventions and solutions to make them work better for our communities. And then, the one thing that I'll kind of let you guys know, personal note for digital equity, I was a recipient of digital equity back when I was in college. I was at the University of Southern Colorado before it was the Colorado State University of Pueblo, and I was a low-income student. And I did not have a computer at all. And so I didn't know what to do, but I found this program through the university, and this goes back to partnerships. They were advertising in our dorm that you can get a computer for free or donate $75. So I gave $75 for my first PC. I mean, it was a huge PC. Everybody had some really slick ones, but I was on I used that computer the whole time I was in college. And if it weren't for that, I wouldn't have had that computer. So it just, it's not just, people that you don't know, but it's people like me too, And so those devices and helping folks that just don't have the resources participate successfully is very important. So those are some of the things that the state of Colorado is doing, and we continue to do. And quite honestly, this digital equity is an ongoing effort. It's not something that just starts and stops with the IIJA funding or any other funding. It's an ongoing process, and the state of Colorado is really putting a lot of resources behind it.
About digital equity from what you're saying sort of at the federal level.
Sure. Very hard to follow these three who have been so eloquent about the importance of digital equity. I think the only thing that I'll maybe add on top of their comments are really in the modern economy, you have to be online. If you want to have a job, let alone have the skills for a job, you have to apply online. If you want to get healthcare, generally you set up an appointment online. If you want to go to school and there's a snow day, there's no such thing as snow day anymore. You have to go to school remotely. You can take classes on nights a week. So it no longer is a thing where you can get away with participating in our modern economy without it. I also want to throw a little credit to Andy Schwartzman, who I was talking to this weekend, and he had made a really good point. And he has said oftentimes we think of digital equity programs as a welfare program, when it's really not a welfare program. What we should be talking about, and the way we should be looking at it, is really a stimulus program or a program that raises the boat for everybody. Because as soon as you get somebody online, you're educating them, they're participating in the economy, maybe they're spending money, they're adding value to the country, to the discourse in a way that brings everybody a positively, and a positive reaction, a positive benefit. So I think that's a really important point and a great way to look at it that we should all keep in mind, but I can't take credit myself. I do also want to add from a nationwide scope of maybe what the problem is. If we look at ACP eligibility, we're looking at about 48 million households that are eligible. ACP eligibility is based upon 200% of the federal poverty limits. That's about $54,000 for a family of 4, give or take a little bit of money. So you're looking at a large number of people. And right now we have approximately 16 million households signed up in the ACP program through the FCC. So there are a lot of people that are getting helped, but that is a big number that we're still looking to try to help and get connected. So there's a lot of work to be done.
Nirali, you want to round us out from your perspective? What are some of the impacts of digital inequity on individuals and communities that you're saying?
I was just going to touch upon, well, hopefully something that I think each of the panelists have said, but with Kathryn mentioning that, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic did give us an added understanding of the digital divide, showing us both the promise of broadband as well as the urgent need to connect everyone. Broadband providers invested heavily in their networks in the 2 decades preceding the pandemic, and that enabled our networks to really be there for the country and enable the country to keep going with working from home, schooling from home. But then the pandemic also highlighted the persistent gaps in deployment and adoption that need to finally be closed so that everyone can participate fully in the digital economy, take advantage of the opportunities, access to telehealth and better health outcomes, educational opportunities, the other pillars that Brandy was mentioning. And I think this is all the more important now that so many, as Justin was saying, critical government services have moved online post-pandemic. So it's all the more important now.
Which is now that we've talked a little bit about sort of the issues, whether that's trust in the programs, getting information out about them, lack of digital skills, problems with access to infrastructure, access to devices, or affordability. We've got a big problem to solve. So let's talk about the solution a little bit. Let's talk about universal broadband. So I'm going to open this up for the panel. What could universal broadband availability and adoption look like in the United States? You know, Francella invited us to use our creativity, so let's put our thinking caps on.
I think when we talk about universal broadband, one of the things I also want to make sure is we're thinking about whatever that is, however you finish that sentence, whatever it is needs to be sustainable. And so this idea of like injecting billions of dollars into a problem to say, oh, we solved it, everybody high five, is just unrealistic. And so if we know that we're going to have to come up with lasting solutions, we have to think about, well, who are the partners that are going to ensure that whatever program you started today can outlast the mayoral administration, the gubernatorial administration, the presidential, office. Like, those programs have to outlast those administrations. So we have to make sure that we have local partners that are not only part of the implementation, but also part of the ideation. And we don't often enough ask them to actually contribute to actually talk about what their communities need. I think very often there are assumptions made. One other thing that I do want to point out is when we're talking about, Justin brought up something, and Andy, tech policy titan. I'm so glad you guys were talking about that. It worries me when I visit cities. I visit a lot of cities. I was just in El Paso, a place where on average, most households of 4 only make around $51,000 a year. That doesn't get you as far, very far. And especially in terms of food costs, housing, all sorts of other things. And when we think about the fact that literally It's something like around like 2/3 of their population is either struggling with like affordability devices or even just knowing how to use, whatever technology is available to them. So that's something that everybody has to be thinking about all the time. Us injecting money into the state of Texas isn't necessarily going to reach that population because there are a whole list of political reasons why it's like, I don't think so. So what are we doing to equip those local leaders to be able to generate solutions for themselves and to also make sure that it goes beyond politics because it's very real, it's a very acute problem for them. And when we also look at cities like whether we're talking about Rochester, St. Louis, West Monroe, Louisiana, all sorts of places outside of the suburbs of Milwaukee. When you go to these places and show up, when we talk about low-income programs, let's remember the digital divides that we have. Many of the low-income areas that were passed over in deployment contributed to the deployment in affluent areas nearby. We use some of their tax dollars to invest in other places that were more profitable. So when we are creating programs to make sure that they can catch up, that is not charity. That is equity. And so I want to make sure when we're framing that, we acknowledge the fact that they contributed to this. And so when we are going back to say, maybe this community needs a little bit more tenderness, a little bit more resources, whatever it is, that's just out of fairness, not because it makes us feel good. And my last note about just the idea of universal broadband, I worry that when we are in a process of reimagining what goes into that, not just getting everyone high-speed access in their neighborhood, but making sure that they can actually get that connection across the threshold of their front door. Like what goes into actually making sure every single one of those residents can benefit from technology, we're gonna have to come up with a better plan than hoping they have a school or a library nearby. Because that works in places where they have it. But if you have been to some places that do not even have a library in their area, and those aren't just urban places, those are rural places as well that depend on their community colleges and other places to plug in, what happens when they don't have an option? So we do need to think about this idea of us pumping money into access, acknowledging that adoption is a problem, but having this imbalance, the way that we're investing in it, we're just still continually like looking at a problem of adoption and saying, we hope the local and state officials work it out. And there aren't enough people like Brandy with stories that are very close to this issue that are actually have an incentive to bring other people into the problem solving. And so I think it's really important for us to be aggressive and deliberate about making sure that when we are crafting programs about universal adoption for low-income populations, I'm gonna say this, and this is gonna blow your mind. Maybe we bring low-income residents into that program, that conversation. That's an easy way to get ideas, instead of just having people who have make assumptions about low-income households. And so these are the things that shouldn't be these, I'm not saying that to disrupt the way people have always done things. What I'm saying is that's the only way for us to do something transformational. Otherwise, we are putting lipstick on a problem that's just gonna we're gonna have to revisit in different ways 5 and 10 years from now.
No, you go ahead.
My standpoint, the universal broadband, to Francella's point, this is just, we need to, one, be thinking about sustainability. But if you're looking at this purely from the perspective of public administration and governance, which is what I do, we are going to be looking for a couple of key things. The first question, if I'm working with a state legislator, the majority of which actually are rural and conservative. Those are the ones that we worked with leading up to a lot of the work pre-COVID and through COVID and now, quite frankly, because they said, we need to focus on this and we need to fix this problem because our towns are dying. So when they come in and we sit down and we say, okay, let's talk shop here. What are we going to do? It always comes down to policy. It comes down to money, enforcement, and then also remembering, to Francella's point, and I think all of us have made some version of this point, politics matters here. So we may not always be talking about it as digital equity. It may be digital opportunity. It may be talking about agribusiness. It may be talking about healthcare access for seniors, aging Americans. Think bigger and think broader about how folks are talking about the implementation and use of these funds. And remember to, I'm stealing your point and tweaking it, sorry, but we need to be inclusive. Creating inclusive policies means being inclusive. And so when we are looking at these things of how are we going to get to, what does universal access look like? It is how did we achieve the metrics that we started out to achieve? Have we continued evolving policy and funding and resources and enforcement to meet those needs? And then how have we evolved strategies to continue meeting the ever-changing needs of our communities and our economies? Because that's not static, and nor do we want it to be static. So be open-minded when you are talking to legislators and when you are talking to other stakeholders about why they're interested in working on these programs, because they may not talk about it in the same language that I do or anybody else up here does, but take that step back and really think about, okay, well, how does this connect to the work that we're doing? And bring them to the table and figure out how you can work them into the solutions that you're trying to solve for.
And I think we're going to be talking about some of the attributes of successful digital equity programs and collaboration efforts later, but just going back to the beginning of one of Francella's comments to this question, I think when it comes to availability, what universal broadband availability looks like and whether we can get there is going to depend on, making the most of this historic $42.5 billion of BEAD funding. And there are so many complex issues that NTIA and the states have to tackle in standing up this unprecedented program. But I think one of the more straightforward keys to success will be insisting on partners with a proven track record of experience. And so with deployment, the Infrastructure Act has requirements around financial, technical, managerial capability, and for good reason. Experience matters. And getting everyone connected as efficiently as possible means prioritizing those providers that have the expertise to build and sustain these networks for the long haul. And so it's just, that's going to be critically important.
Okay, Jenny, real quick.
Yeah.
And so from the FCC's perspective, I think the answer has to be a combination of technology. We talk a lot about fiber right now, but if you look at the way that we study broadband deployment in the United States, at least through the FCC, and things like our 706 report, which studies whether broadband has been deployed, or advanced communication services, if you want a real techie term, or our CMR report, which is the Communications Marketplace report, which is a gigantic broad scope report we put out every 2 years. We study fiber, we study cable deployment, we study satellite, fixed wireless and mobile wireless. So there's probably going to be some sort of combination of all of these services to make sure that people can be connected. And it's something that I think we need to keep in mind as we're discussing the solutions, because 42 billion, if we deploy fiber everywhere, is not going to go as far as if we deploy it in places where it's reasonable to deploy and look at other solutions elsewhere. And for the students, I wanted to take us off point, but not actually take the panel off point. There is a proceeding of the FCC on digital discrimination right now. And that is a proceeding to look at and try to determine whether in the past maybe digital discrimination has occurred or hasn't, but also how to ensure it doesn't occur going forward, especially given some of the funds that are being spent. And so that's a really important topic. It's open, so I don't want to talk about it, but it's a great thing for you all to look at as you're looking to see sort of what are the big issues that industry is going to be looking at going forward, and something you might want to be focusing on.
And just one last point, so all of that, obviously, and, for Colorado, and I'll just be quick, universal broadband coverage for the state looks like closing the gap of 14% of our locations. That 14% of our locations will probably make up 80% of the funding that's going to be deployed. And so we have approximately 360,000 locations that are unserved or underserved. So universal coverage means closing the divide of 14% of those locations. One thing that I just wanted to add to the panel, because everybody had really great points that I agree with and make a lot of sense in universal coverage and bridging the divide for good, is the community education is really important. And going back to finding what language works, equity is a trigger word in half the state of Colorado. And I love the idea of digital opportunity. and why is it relevant? And so when we're going to communities that don't necessarily have the sophistication or understand why it's important, I think finding those little pieces of relatable action that you can help them address. So agriculture, you have to run a lot of your ag equipment off of internet, and one of the things that I talk to communities about, especially really rural ones, is what can you do to participate in closing the digital divide? Because half of it's funding, the other half is when they show up to your office for a permit, and so we can't have one without the other. And so when we're talking to communities as a state, we set up a broadband community ready program, which is a volunteer program, which helps educate communities that don't know, because being in community, I used to be a city manager, and I've been in those communities where I didn't know much about broadband and how it works. Reaching out to them and saying, hey, this is why, when ISPs come to you, this is what you need to do to make sure you're ready to receive them. Because if they get funding and you have to wait 2 or 3 years to deploy, you're not going to achieve the results. So working directly with those communities that we know that lack that education has been something that's been really helpful. We've talked to mayors, city council members, board members, commissioners, and everything. They're like, well, what can we do to help you? It's like, well, let's take a deeper dive in your own backyard and figure out how you can become ready so that you can serve the needs of your community. And finding that common language and breaking it down so that they can understand it, because it is complex and there's a lot of moving pieces and stuff. So that was just one thing that I would add, is just the community education piece.
Mm-hmm. So I want to pick up this piece about successful digital equity programs. Brandy, you've talked about what Colorado is doing. So I want to transition now to Kathryn and say, or to ask really, like, what are the examples of successful digital equity programs that you are seeing in your research, and what lessons or scalability can we learn from that?
Yeah, I think going back to the point that I made earlier about how we look at this, it really is about how is a state defining digital equity. And one, it's starting with that, what's our goal for universal coverage? And to Brandy's earlier point, thank you for making this, it's going to look different in each state. Yes, they may all be shooting for 100%, 98%, but it's going to be more granular and specific than that. So that's really where we start. But it does come back to policy enforcement funding and how are they really tying it to other policy priorities. And I think to that point, well, I'll come back to that, but specifically, we're still looking at the implementation. I work for a research organization, so this stuff takes time. But looking at the initial research that we did on state programs, we really did find that the most successful programs were ones that took deliberate steps in these areas of policy enforcement funding. Colorado is one such example. An example is converting the high cost fund and being able to use that for deployment. California is really the state that not only has the most, had the most comprehensive approach, but it also has been doing it for the longest. They have a task force that is separated into subcommittees that focuses on specific issues of importance, whether that's tribal connectivity, affordable housing, or really planning for the future. Because the state had taken this digital equity as important for the overall health and sustainability of the state, because they have been taking that approach for so long, that's really why you saw Governor Newsom taking the steps that he did and setting up such a bold strategy with the federal funding that they're implementing now, particularly for the Open Access Mile program, or Open Access Middle Mile program. Looking at things like the spend and then enforcement. A state like Virginia, they've got a pilot program on affordable housing. So how are they, and line extensions. So how are they really getting to the hardest and most expensive communities to serve by setting aside funds for specific uses and for specific communities? Again, rolling in that affordability piece to this, because this is about the business case. And if you think you can divorce the two, you cannot. The last piece is enforcement. It's reporting. It's super sexy. So are you asking for the right information? Are you sending people out in the field to do the field verification? And are you also getting feedback from community members? Are you really testing and probing against what is being reported to verify that it is accurate? So I think that that's really what we will look for generally moving forward, and really how is it embedded in the state's operations, and what are the goals that they are laying out?
Nirali, did you want to weigh in here on sort of the provider perspective on successful programs here?
Sure, just to add on, our members have been working with the public sector and also nonprofit partners to really focus on programs that tackle multiple barriers to adoption and rely on trusted voices in the community to help address those. So examples include working with local public housing officials and nonprofit partners, not only to raise awareness about the Affordable Connectivity Program and help residents sign up, but then also having techs on hand to help them set up their Wi-Fi. Having learning centers that provide access to Wi-Fi and devices other than smartphones, but then also having access to digital skilling content that's been created in partnership with public libraries, things like that. And then to a point Brandy was making earlier, beyond adoption, workforce development programs are so important to advancing digital equity. Our members have partnered with high schools and community colleges to develop STEM curricula to prepare students from underrepresented communities for jobs in tech. And they've partnered with tribal organizations on apprenticeship programs so that residents can develop skills to deploy and maintain broadband in their communities. So things like that, I think, are going to be really important going forward.
Thank you. So I want to get us to our discussion on broadband subsidies, but before we do that, Justin, could I ask you to weigh in about the FCC's role on deployment and adoption, sort of zooming back out to the federal level again, now that we've had this great discussion of local efforts?
Sure. I feel like some of the students probably have a whole class on this, so I'm going to go quick because I know we want to leave time for other questions. So the FCC historically has been the agency dealing with broadband deployment. It's really great that we have now had so many partners with so many different viewpoints and expertise coming in, including NTIA and Alan, which you all heard yesterday. RUS has long been a group that has worked with the FCC to ensure that broadband deployment is going out. And one of the reasons why the FCC is so important in this is we control and collect a lot of data. So we put out the reports I talked about earlier. You may have heard, if you're in this industry, there are some maps that the FCC is putting out that are very important to the BEAD program and to everybody else. And that will determine and help show where underserved and unserved communities are. The FCC also, for a long time, has sort of set the stage for what broadband is through different reports, as well as our Universal Service Fund, which helps support schools and libraries, helps support telehealth, helps support deployment in high-cost areas, and it also helps support service for a program called Lifeline. But as part of that, we would help identify where is unserved and also the speeds that are necessary for companies to receive the funding, which sort of sets the baseline that other companies would be trying to compete, going from things back in the day like a 4.1 to 25.3 and now 120, which is also in the BEAD program. So the FCC has long been working on this and has been sort of the agency because of our expertise with the telephone system going back to 1934 and the natural transition of technology into broadband that people are looking at. On affordability, that has been a little bit more of a recent program with the ACP funding that we've been really able to get out. While NTIA is focusing on, let's make sure broadband is everywhere, we are really trying to focus on, let's make sure if it's everywhere that you can actually get to it. And some of our panelists have talked about, look, if you are a low-income household, you have other expenses, broadband is really hard. And I think the better way to look at it is if you are a low-income household and you can't afford broadband, if you can't afford for food or your housing or heat, then you really don't have a choice at all. So we're trying to find ways where we can eliminate that choice. And through a lot of Nirali's and other industry partners, technology literacy is very important too. But there have been a lot of companies that have come together to ensure that they're offering broadband at a $30 a month price, which is the exact amount of the ACP subsidy, to ensure that broadband is either free or subsidized to a very low amount of money so that we can get as many people signed up. So that's some of the work the FCC has been doing. I'd be happy to talk more after this, but I want to make sure I don't tie down the program.
just about the FCC, because I think I want to give credit where credit is due, that I think the FCC particularly is recognizing the importance and urgency of making sure that it fulfills its promise of universal broadband. Totally agree with that. But there are a lot of things that are just not structurally a part of the FCC. For example, the FCC has always had very, very lopsided power dynamics. And so there is overrepresentation of companies and underrepresentation of residents who aren't connected. So the problem is that the voices that are constantly being piped into the FCC that eventually really sometimes their voices are adopted verbatim as orders. The issue is that the people who don't have agency, who aren't on the work groups, who don't know where to file digital discrimination comments are never a part of the dialogue. And so that's the part where I think that we're at a moment where people are seeing how insidious that has been in terms of the how that actually shows up in a community. Because for a long time, we could hide behind the internet's new and it's really a luxury. And it was really very strategic to even use that language to call it a luxury, because then it made it okay if everybody didn't have it. And I'm not saying that that's intentional. I'm saying that that's just real. And whether or not it's intentional, that was the impact. And so when we're in a moment where we have to start questioning structures and thinking about, well, why have we been doing it that way for that long? When we're thinking about examples, Gabrielle, that you just asked about places that are doing it well, when I think about how brave it was for the state of Wisconsin to, in the middle of a pandemic, say we are going to take mapping into our own hands and literally asked residents to go outside, use this speed test and send us your information, just because they felt like they didn't know what else to do. And so that was really brave, because they started a whole bunch of other states saying, hey, well, we could do something more. Places like Fort Collins, Colorado, they used to have a meeting, and once a year they have a meeting where they just dream about what they can do with broadband. That is outrageous, that they literally ask a representative of every single city department to come to a meeting so they can dream about how they can do it better. And then they have to report out on what they are doing to advance universal broadband goals. When you go to Arlington County, Virginia, one of the places that's one of the most connected counties in the United States, they still have a problem with low-income households being able to adopt in their home that rely disproportionately on libraries and schools. And even they say, you know what, it's not enough for us to have a broadband office working on it. We need to make sure that we have people who are tasked with this as part of their area of responsibility in housing, in education, in the library services, in social services where we hand out food coupons and think about who's getting housing coupons. They want everybody thinking about it. And so I just want to encourage people in this room that it is not enough for us to just think about the way the structures are set up right now and say that's enough. We have to be in a place where we're okay with saying, yes, we need to do, all of these things with the money that's coming in, and we need to do something else. Because very often when we talk about government agencies, we say, yes, but it's so hard. Yeah, we need this, but it's too hard. It's too expensive. We don't have enough resources. But if we were talking to a company, we'd say, yes, you should do it. Yeah, we'll give you money to experiment. Sure, you should get those subsidies. Try. If you didn't get it right, try again. And we don't mind. So I'm saying maybe we're at the moment where we can say to our government agencies, yes, and. Yes, I need you to do this. And I need you to rethink why we do it the way we do it. And so that's why I think it's inadequate for us to just stop at yes and then talk ourselves out of what we should be doing with but. And I think just to bring it back to one example, I don't know if it's appropriate for me to bring it up, Gabrielle, in a different capacity when we were working with the University of California, Berkeley, law school, working on a report that was so incredibly important to me. I think it's an important way for states to hold themselves accountable, to actually partner with an academic institution that keeps them accountable on an ongoing basis. Look at Indiana and what Purdue Economic Development's department is doing that holds them accountable to actually say, how are you investing and are the people who need it getting the money? So when we think about, we were working on low-income programs last year with the program that Gabrielle was involved in. One of the questions that came up from the students was what happens when you have people, all of the court hearings were being translated, basically converted to being online. And what happens when you have one person in the room, the defendant, who is the only person on the phone, and everybody else is on video? What happens then? When we are making decisions for people and cutting them out of it. And so We ended up doing this entire access to justice report. The students actually went out, questioned social service providers, they questioned public defenders, all of these other people, and shockingly, most of them didn't even know about low-income broadband programs. They were talking to the very population that needed it and didn't even know about it. And so it goes back to, maybe that's a cue for us to say, yeah, the ACP program's awesome, but we also need the FCC to do more on community engagement. It can be both. And there's something at stake for the people who are on the phone, for us to get it right and to ask hard questions and to be uncomfortable with the answer. And so I think just in general, when we're having these conversations, it's hard for this to be clinical for me because I show up in town hall meetings. I sometimes help people with their slide decks. I talk to the constituents, and all the time, what they tell us is that we don't know where to go, but we know this is a problem in our neighborhood. And so it behooves all of us to find a way that even if we don't know how to get to that neighborhood, that we go into our own meetings and ask about who's at our table. And have we done enough to stretch in our office, in our organization, in our constituencies, instead of making assumptions about the people we say we serve?
Go ahead,
If I
Nirali.
could just add to the comments Francella was making. Of course, there is more to be done, I think, by all stakeholders involved as far as continuing to raise awareness about the ACP program and getting digital navigators to help eligible consumers sign up. But I think the other thing I wanted to just touch upon is that the program having nearly 16 million households enrolled as of last week and more than 1,300 providers participating in it does need to continue, and yet funding for the program could run out early next year. And so it's going to be critical that Congress provide additional funding for ACP. Broadband prices have been falling and running counter to inflationary trends, but the ACP program needs to continue for those who need it most. And it's just going to be something that must be done in order to continue addressing all of the issues that we've been discussing today.
I want to use this to transition now to our last question so that we can kind of start to tie some of these threads together, whether that's subsidies, whether that's affordability, whether that's digital skills, whether that's knowledge and trust, all of these problems that we're still facing, and all of the creative solutions that folks have talked about and the need and the work that's still to be done. So where do we go from here? What advocacy, policy research, or other work is on your wish list for making progress on these issues for you, for the constituencies that you're serving? And I'd love to hear from everybody on this.
Would you like me to start?
Please do, kick us off.
Sure. I'll mention two things, one with respect to Universal Service Fund and then one with respect to BEAD. So having a sustainable Universal Service Fund is going to be really important for things like maintaining broadband networks that are built in the most remote and hardest to reach rural areas of this country. But the current contribution system for the USF is outdated and regressive. It's based on a dwindling number of landline telephone lines, and that isn't sustainable. And so the USF contributions base does need to be expanded to include those companies who benefit the most from universal broadband connectivity, but don't contribute today, so that all major online players are paying their fair share. With respect to BEAD, I just wanted to mention that NTIA in the states are going to have to balance a number of policy goals of the program with the realities of deployment on the ground, including the time it takes to ramp up more domestic production, supply chain issues, skilled workforce shortages. And so those are all going to be hurdles that need to be tackled as we try to get broadband deployed out to everyone as quickly as possible. And so balance and flexibility on a number of fronts with respect to NTIA and the state's implementation of BEAD is going to be critical to maximize participation from broadband providers of all sizes throughout the country.
Yeah, I think going forward, the issues that we'll be going at, one that Nirali wisely mentioned is ACP funding is going to be a big question that is likely to run out next year. It will run out quicker as we get the program more successful, which is sort of a strange situation that we're facing, but that's a good problem. The more people we can get in there, the more we can help, the better it will be for funding. So that's something we'll certainly be looking at. Universal service going forward is a really important question for the FCC and for Congress. As Nirali said, contribution reform has been on the agenda for a long time. I wrote comments for it in 2008. And we're still working on it, and the problem has gotten worse. And the other thing, especially for the law students to be looking at, there are some very interesting court cases in the Fifth Circuit, Sixth Circuit, and I believe the 11th, challenging the constitutionality of the Universal Service Fund. And the Fifth Circuit in particular is a circuit that's very comfortable blowing things up. And if that happens, that's going to be quite a change for what has been going on with universal service and broadband and voice support for the last 20 years. And it's going to be something that we're going to be looking at a lot. So that's something I think going forward that's going to be receiving a lot of advocacy from the FCC. And ultimately, as BEAD is deployed, once we have an idea what BEAD looks like, how successful it is, and sort of what remains after BEAD funding has gone out. What is the role of the FCC in this area? Is it something where we should be transitioning USF because we don't need a high cost fund into supporting affordability only? Is it something where we're always going to need to be working to replace fiber because ultimately fiber, while more future-proof, is not legitimately future-proof? It is a piece of technology like anything else that will need to be replaced over time. What is sort of the role the FCC should be playing in this? And that's something that we'll be looking for advocacy on in the coming years.
Yeah, so from the state of Colorado's perspective, I'll just keep it kind of high level because we are heavily involved in planning and implementation right now of the various federal funded programs. But if I were to say what we're going to be doing going forward, is making funding and broadband friendly policy permanent in our state. We talked a little bit about the high cost support mechanism funds. The state's looking at a sunset review of that program next year, and so really advocating for to kind of convert it into a broadband sustainability fund, as well as looking at digital equity. There's still a lot of work that has to be done though. Sunset reviews are really heavily involved, but where can we identify resources that make these investments permanent? Because what I'm really worried about, and government does this all the time, is we set it and forget it, and then then we pay for it 3 times. And so, my work will probably be mostly dedicated to figuring out how do we maximize this investment, make sure it lasts for generations from a funding and policy perspective. The other thing is funneling resources to parts of Colorado that have lacked investment by the private sector, really subsidizing investment in those areas. Again, going back to business case, there is really no business case in some parts of Colorado. That's just a fact. And so, really targeting those resources over there so that we can encourage providers to invest, or even support community broadband networks. There's a few in the state, not many, but I don't want to take a one size fits all with our communities. I want to fund what they see as sustainable and it's going to work for their community. And then also accountability to funding. I always tell groups, these federal programs are really robust. They're complicated. There's no such thing as ask for forgiveness later, because if you want to pay for that, that's fine, but we don't want to see that. So we're really looking to fund providers and communities that can make sure these investments are spent the right way, and that they're lasting. They're doing what they say they're going to do. Because there's a monitoring piece around all of that. So making sure we're holding folks accountable to these really, really important dollars, because we will not see them again. And then obviously partnerships continue to be the name of the game for the Colorado Broadband Office, whether it's workforce development, working with industry to make sure that we're crafting the best approaches, and then matching communities to the private sector. There's a lot of communities that don't even know what providers are in their community. And so every time I start a call with community, I'm like, well, do you know who your providers are? Well, no, we just don't know. We just have bad internet, and it's like, well, there's providers on the call. So really being the matchmaker for community and the private industry to make sure that, that we're leveraging those partnerships, and that people feel good about their partnerships, because there's a lot of fly-by-night CD operations out there, and we're going to be looking at those. We're going to be looking for those folks that can make this happen on behalf of the community and on behalf of the state of Colorado and our federal government. So that's what we're going to be doing over the next couple years, Of course, that's the tip of the iceberg, but those are the high level things.
Folks have hit on a lot of the points that, I would also like to make. I think what I would add, or what I would say specifically is really looking at this about vision and sustainability. So first, we've got a lot of work to do, I think, at the federal level when it comes to clarifying, what is our goal for digital equity? What does that mean? And more importantly, how is that reflected in implementation across the many, many programs that focus on broadband and digital equity within federal government? To the point that I think everyone has made, these programs that we are looking at, particularly with BEAD and DEA, they are going to be very complex to implement. They are going to involve a lot of actors and streams of funding that states have some authority over and many more that they don't. And so we are going to learn a lot over the next few years about where things are going well and where there can be room for improvement. And getting to that point, sustainability is the really important thing here because that work starts today, whether we're talking about sustainability through state funding, whether we are talking about really looking at the subsidies, again, supply or demand side, because we need both, because the internet service providers are right. It's expensive to maintain, to deploy networks. We are always going to need those subsidies if we want to achieve and maintain universal access and ensure that those connections are improved over time. In the same way that we are always going to need subsidies for affordable access, like we need subsidies in other areas. But those subsidies don't matter if they, one, aren't achieving what they are supposed to, and if we don't really take that step back to evaluate what is working well and why. And the biggest lesson from the rollout from a lot of the emergency programs in COVID was, yes, the demand for those subsidies is high, the need is high, but we have a lot of work to do when it comes to understanding the barriers that stand in the way of folks signing up for those programs. And that's feedback that we have heard from providers, from community members, and state and local officials. So, from my standpoint, always looking ahead to implementation, what are we building to and why? But more importantly, how are we really thinking about embedding this in government and learning to build towards a more sustainable system?
A few notes about, I think, what we can do at different levels of government. At the federal level, I think there are a lot of agencies that are working on broadband that aren't talking to each other. And so I think that if the FCC wants to be the central lead, it should flex. Like, we're in charge, this is what we're doing. I think that it's difficult to do things that are ambitious as long as there are only 4 commissioners. So we're not able to actually achieve visionary policy. I think so it'll always be a tepid response as to what we're able to do. But I think that the FCC in particular is always in a very reactive posture to a problem that is incredibly dynamic and needs visionary solutions. So that existential conundrum, I think, is something we need to think about. For NTIA, that I think is rightfully the steward for handing out IIJA funds. I think that we need to think about the fact that their requirement under IIJA is disclosure, like how did they just distribute the money, not to evaluate effectiveness. And so if we won't know really how this money has been filtered through states, how effective it was for really maybe 5 to 10 years from now, what do we do in between to make sure that we're staying on course for our goals? At the state and local level, I hope that local leaders and state leaders are doing more of what I see them do more frequently now. And that's really take hold of this being an issue that is going to determine, which states have increased populations, which states have more tax revenues. Like, they are thinking about this as a workforce development issue, an issue to make sure people can live longer. So they are taking a very forward-looking approach to developing broadband policy in a way that does not exist in federal conversations. So I think that that's something really important. And at the local level, local leaders are some of the scrappiest, most resourceful people I have ever met on the planet. A lot of them do not have the resources to do the things that they need to do on a daily basis, and they still have to be accountable to their constituents. I wish we had that same level of accountability at the federal level. And I think that sometimes we talk about the things that we're putting in place to set up parameters of programs, but there's very little follow through in terms of enforcement and really doing periodic checking to make sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to. And maybe as a last point for people who are working on this issue, I think that we need to think in longitudinal ways about how does this change people. I've been part of a research study from a school in a university in North Carolina, and they have followed maybe about 50,000 of us across the country since I was 11. And so they can tell us in our population set, depending on where we were born, based on our zip code, how much money we make today, they can estimate. They can estimate how long I will live. They can tell you with granularity, all sorts of things about me that I had never even thought of. And part of it is that they test us, they check up on us every 3 to 5 years. They have ongoing data sets to kind of understand how did we migrate around the US, what were our outcomes, both economic and also health. We know that broadband is an underpinning of all these programs we care about, and we can't talk about what happens when people don't have it. And so maybe this is a moment where we need to start asking questions. What happens when you're born into a household or zip code that's unlikely to have access? What are your outcomes like? How are your economic outcomes different? Do you live longer? Do you live shorter? Do you work with your hands, or do you have a 401k? There are a lot of questions that we just don't know the answers to that I think we can do better on research.
With that excellent set of questions, I think that we are at time. So please join me in thanking our panelists.